All right, we are roughly about a minute.
45 seconds.
All right, we're about 30 seconds. So I will make the broadcast inside of the webinar here live.
Welcome to our 9 North Compass programs. 9 North is jumping into the community conversations with timely subject matter that's been magnified because of the pandemic. Throughout 2021, we'll be hosting a series of listening sessions about different topics that impact our community. Today, we're going to be talking about broadband access in suburban and rural areas. In March of 2020, many of us migrated into our homes, turned on our laptops, and began working remotely. Schooling migrated online, businesses meetings online, and even our social lives migrated online. What about people who don't have access to the internet, specifically broadband access? How has the pandemic affected their ability to work and connect? What can our communities and agencies do to include our distant neighbors into the social circles of an online community? Today, we'll be speaking to a panel of policy and broadband professionals to provide us insight to broadband buildouts in rural areas, or lack of, and why. Our panelists include Nathan Zacharias, the lobbyist for the Minnesota Rural Broadband Coalition and the project manager for the Minnesota Speed Test. Anna Boroff, the executive director of the Minnesota Cable Communications Association, a trade association for cable providers in Minnesota. And Bernadine Jocelyn, the Director of Public Policy and Engagement of the Blandin Foundation that works to strengthen rural Minnesota communities. Thank you all for joining us today.
Thanks.
We have 8 questions today about broadband, giving each of you 2 minutes to answer and provide value to our viewers from your perspective. At the end of the program, you'll each have a minute for closing remarks about broadband access. Nathan, we're going to start with you for the first question, followed by Anna and then Bernadine. How's that sound?
Good.
Perfect. Great. So Nathan, why is access to broadband services valuable and important for people in rural areas?
15 years ago, some people might have said broadband is a luxury, but today it's an essential part of our daily lives. And as you said, the pandemic has put a big, bright spotlight on this issue. Around 15% of rural Minnesota, 157,000 households, are unserved by a broadband connection. We need broadband to stay connected to each other, to do business, to grow our food, to educate our children, and to deliver healthcare. I'll give you 3 examples here. Farms, big or small, are businesses. Broadband connects them to their markets, real-time information about weather patterns, and potential customers. In Minnesota, many of our farmers are competing in an international marketplace, and too many of them aren't on a level playing field if they don't have broadband. On education, COVID has changed the way students are learning for sure, but even before that, schools started to have e-learning days instead of snow days. If you're a rural school that doesn't have ubiquitous service in your district, you're not going to be able to have those e-learning days. Study after study shows that students without access to quality broadband in their homes are at a disadvantage from students who do have access. And on healthcare, telehealth, as cheesy as this line sounds, doesn't work without telecommunications. Connecting rural hospitals with their patients with a tablet or a computer is next to impossible if the patient does not have broadband. And I'll end with this. Strong broadband in rural communities leads to strong economic development for all industries. If you want to keep the workers that you have, make sure that they have access to good broadband.
Thank you so much for that, Nathan. So Anna, same question for you. Why is access to broadband services valuable and important for people in rural areas?
Good evening. Thank you so much for having me. First, Dana, I think it's really cool to see the production studios like yours that our customers support talk about topics like this that are important to the state. So I've been really excited about this. I think we're all going to agree that broadband is important for everyone in the state. There's just no question anymore that, everyone needs access to broadband now, whether it's my family trying to connect 4 kids to their classroom and, parents trying to work from home, or if it's someone who wants to stay in their rural community or connect their farm technology, like Nathan said. So the pandemic has almost made the case for us that the internet is essential, and it's a connection that drives our commerce, our healthcare, now even more our education, and even government as we watch, even the legislature this past year operate remotely. So, no one thinks anymore that students, driving to town for Wi-Fi is okay. And so that's why we, even when we knew before how crucial access was going to be, we made huge investments in our infrastructure. And then when the pandemic hit, we watched our networks really carefully when we shifted to working and learning at home, and we saw those significant surges in online activity. So those networks stood up, and that's not an accident. We understand its importance, and we've been really purposeful in our investments across the state. So like Nathan said, we've reached 92% of the state with broadband. We've made a lot of progress. So that's where we are at now. And now we have to focus on expanding to those last remaining areas.
Thank you so much for that, Anna. Bernadine, why is access for broadband services valuable and important for people in rural areas?
Thank you so much, Dana, for having us today. And I want to echo Anna in commending your program for tackling this topic. It really is critical to all of Minnesota, including the rural communities that Blandin Foundation cares so much about. I think Nathan and Anna did a great job of illustrating what I like to often say, that everything's better with broadband. Everything's better with better broadband. But even I think thinking, especially in the at the time we are, where we're transitioning to a new administration and we're seeing our democracy in action, to understand how foundational equal access to a free and open internet is to our society. And so I think, it's important to ask why it's important to rural areas, but it's also important to all of us as Minnesotans, because as in a democratic society, if you're denied access to the internet, you're denied opportunity. And so it's important for all the reasons that we heard about from Anna and Nathan, but also just because we can't really function as an informed democracy without everybody having access to a free and open internet, affordable access.
Thank you so much for that, Bernadine. So that'll take us over to our next question, which I'm sure each of you will have great insight on this. What are the challenges to get broadband networks into rural areas? And Anna, I'd love to start with you on this one.
Sure. I mean, I don't think it's a surprise to most that the last miles of service are the most expensive. And those last miles get really, really expensive when we're talking about the last farm, the last road to the furthest field, or, I'm thinking of northern Minnesota where the terrain is just, really difficult and rocky, which, we have in Minnesota. So these communities can be really remote, or they can be maybe just outside the metro where there's a lot more spaces between homes and long setbacks and long driveways from the road. areas that might not even have city water or sewer. And so those are kind of the challenges that makes projects not able sometimes to make that private business case for 100% private investment. There's just not a return on investment where a company can sink that kind of capital in on its own. And so the Office of Broadband Development has maps that show in Minnesota where there is broadband and where there's not. And, we've done a great job in sort of reducing that percentage of the state that's still unserved. And so we'll talk about those programs, I'm sure, in a little bit, but that goes towards those really difficult and expensive areas of the state to serve.
Thank you so much for that, Anna. Bernadine, what do you see are the challenges to get broadband networks in rural areas with your experience at Blandon?
Thanks, Dana. Well, I think that in classic economic terms, the absence of ubiquitous broadband across Minnesota, what Governor Walz calls border-to-border broadband, is really market failure. It's just pure and simple, as Anna described to us. Due to low population density, it's simply not profitable for for-profit companies to make the investments necessary to build broadband in sparsely populated areas. I mean, cost estimates vary, and as Anna pointed out, some of those last mile connections can be up to $18,000 to $22,000 a mile per drop, and that's just very difficult from for-profit companies that are driven by their shareholders' interests to make those kinds of investments. And so those communities are left behind, absent a public policy solution. And that's why we need public investment in both broadband adoption and access. And it's great we're going to get to talk about how here in Minnesota we've come together with those kind of investments. We often frame public policy solutions around the question about what is the role, right, of state in society? What are our shared goals? And what do we owe one another in a democracy? Is broadband a human right? In March of this last year, the United Nations Council of the General Assembly declared access to the internet a basic human right. But in the United States here, access to broadband and the skills to use it remain dictated largely by your zip code and your income. So that's why we really do need public investments, like we've come together as a state here in Minnesota to help redress these inequities and level that playing field. Public investments in broadband, result in household savings. We heard Nathan talk about that. Telemedicine's a great example of that. We've seen research showing that the return on investment to the taxpayer for broadband access and adoption is more than 4 to 1. So other challenges I would just say quickly about getting access or getting broadband in rural communities has to do with people. In my experience, the challenge is like 20% technology and more like 80% sociology. It's this need for local leadership in the absence of a market solution. Local residents have to step up and recognize, and I like to quote Jerry Garcia, who said, somebody's got to do something, and it's just incredibly pathetic that it has to be us. If your community, the people that are listening to the show tonight, if you don't have good internet now, you've been left behind by the market, and there's nobody coming to save you but yourself. You've got to come together and organize and figure out how to incent a provider that doesn't have the market incentive to and use public tools to get that investment.
Thank you so much for that, Bernadine. So Nathan, the same question for you. What are the challenges to get broadband networks to rural areas?
Yeah, I completely agree with everything that's been said so far. It is incredibly expensive to build these networks and very difficult for businesses to make the case to do it. It's a big problem to connect these final houses, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't shy away from the problem. There are solutions to this, and this is exactly when the state or federal government needs to step up and say, okay, we're going to help you solve this problem. One other thing I wanted to mention here, I'll be brief because I think Anna and Bernadine did say basically everything that I planned to. The bottom line is we can't solve a problem that we can't measure. And we need to know exactly where service exists and where it doesn't. We have a pretty good idea right now, but we don't know on an address level granularity where broadband service is available. That starts with our broadband maps. The Minnesota Rural Broadband is creating a map with that granular detail based on speed tests from across the state. We're hopeful this map will be useful to communities that are looking to make a plan, like Bernadine said, get a local leader, partner with an ISP, make a plan to bring service to the area. Hopefully our maps can be helpful for that.
Thank you so much for that, Nathan. So this next question, we're going to start with Bernadine. How can broadband adoption increase economic growth in rural areas?
No, that is a great question. I think that broadband fueled or broadband enabled communities, society offer many benefits to all Minnesotans, and they should be available to all of us, regardless of where we live. I think that metro areas and rural areas that our interests are mutually interdependent, and the more vibrant and prosperous and welcoming and internet connected rural Minnesota is, the better it is for all of us. Just a couple examples of how broadband can fuel economic development in rural and really in all communities is that broadband helps household pocketbooks. I don't know how many people really realize this, but there's a range of estimates and research been done on this topic that households that have a broadband connection can save over $8,000 a year simply by moving their interactions online. And broadband creates jobs and profits for everybody. The research shows that about almost a quarter, 23% of all new jobs created in economies are directly attributable to broadband and broadband connectivity. And we know that broadband grows economies as a whole. We did some research at Blandin Foundation that showed an increase in the adoption and the use of broadband could grow our economy here in Minnesota by over $500 million. Just right here at home, my husband, we have a fantastic broadband internet service here, and he manages a online retail vintage magazine business that he could not operate without a blazing fast fiber to the home, a symmetrical broadband service. And another example, especially from a rural perspective, is that we've seen that the ability to go online with ordering and promotion was absolutely essential for our rural businesses on Main Street. And rural community residents really came around their local businesses who were able to do, switch to online ordering and delivery and pickup during the pandemic. We haven't even talked about all the environmental benefits that we from going more online, where people can telecommute and save all those hydrocarbons from going out into the area, and just the overall quality of place. If you have, in the age of with a broadband connection, you can work from anywhere, and so communities that have the broadband infrastructure to support knowledge workers and entrepreneurs and people that work from home will benefit from those new residents. So there's lots of ways that it benefits rural communities and all of Minnesota.
Thank you so much for that, Bernadine. So now we're going to move to Anna. How can broadband adoption increase economic growth in rural areas? What are your thoughts?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And Bernadine brings up a lot of, the things that we've seen certainly during the pandemic become so important. And I think it's important because there's challenges. We're talking about broadband adoption now. And that's important because there's challenges beyond just network ability when it comes to the adoption of broadband, whether that's in rural areas or in suburban areas or all over the state. And we know having more people online can contribute significantly to the quality of life, again, in jobs, education, telemedicine, all those things. There are barriers beyond just infrastructure that I think are worth thinking about. That can be cost, it can be digital literacy, it could be access to hardware. I think those should be part of the discussions to ensure we bring all Minnesotans online too. And I'm sure we've all been in the position, either ourselves or someone we know, we're trying to help someone we know get connected. Connection is more than just that network connection or availability. So whether it's moving the position of our wireless router or updating our laptop hardware or purchasing speeds that make sense for our families, those are part of all the online experience. And I think when we address all those factors related to broadband adoption, I think we know it'll pay off in terms of economic investment.
Thank you so much for that. So Nathan, what are your thoughts? How can broadband adoption increase economic growth in rural areas?
Yeah, I think about someone like Bernadine's husband who's opening a small business in rural Minnesota. And say you open up a retail store in a town of 5,000 people. That town and the surrounding communities are more or less the limit of your potential customers. But if you have access to broadband, you can develop a modern website that has a digital storefront. This opens your business to a far wider audience than if you only had your brick and mortar location. Not only that, but you could also have a strong social media presence. It takes a lot of bandwidth to upload videos and photos to social media on a regular basis. You'd also need broadband to manage the day-to-day operations if you wanted to store information in the cloud and access it whenever you need to, whether that's at home or at your business. And really, it comes down to efficiency because businesses are much more efficient when they can use broadband. And if you have efficient, successful businesses, your community can thrive. I also think about people my age who are looking to maybe buy their first or maybe a second home, start a family. I don't know anyone in my generation that would buy a house without a broadband connection. We grew up on the internet. We were the first ones to use social media platforms. We were the first ones to get our parents to buy Netflix so we could use their password in college. And I think my story is pretty common. I grew up in a rural farming community. Now I live in the Twin Cities, but I'd like to move to a small town again. I just can't imagine doing that unless the house I bought had a great connection, though.
Thank you so much for that, Nathan. Actually, Nathan, we're going to start with you on this question as well. I kind of shuffled the order a little bit. So you get a second one. Why don't we have networks built out in rural areas? And I know we did touch a little bit on that, but if maybe you can expand on that a bit.
Yeah, so what we have right now is a patchwork of highly successful networks and then areas without any service at all. A lot of the networks that were built 5 or more years ago, and that's not all of them, but a lot of them that were built a while back in rural Minnesota don't meet our needs anymore. Internet usage has increased exponentially in the last decade. And we've talked a lot about how much people depend on the internet. And I can't stress that enough. The amount of bandwidth that we use in 2021 is drastically different than what we used in 2010. The low-hanging fruit out there has been picked, so to speak. ISPs have built or are building in areas that make financial sense, like towns, cities, more densely populated areas. And what's left are these places with small populations, sometimes miles away from the nearest towns. Fewer potential customers to help recoup the investment, higher project costs. You get the picture. Now, what we need is for the state legislature to step up and fully fund our border-to-border broadband infrastructure grant program. We know that it'll take $120 million over the next 2 years to connect every Minnesotan to broadband service at 25 megabits per second download and 3 megabits per second upload. And this is one of those rare problems that can actually be solved with money. We just need to make the investment.
Thank you so much for that, Nathan. Anna, let's kick it over to you. Why don't we have networks built out in rural areas?
Yeah, first, I think I want to be clear that, for 92% of the state, we have built out networks and we're making progress all the time on this. Building networks take time. We live in Minnesota. We have short construction seasons. So we have been making significant progress on this. Fortunately, While cost remains an issue for many of them, the reasons I mentioned earlier, I would say that it's looking like funding will not be as much of an impediment in the coming years as it was. I think I agree with Nathan. We just have to stay focused on ensuring that those remaining households in Minnesota that don't have access to broadband are prioritized. And the federal government is making a huge investment in Minnesota's last remaining unserved areas through the Rural Digital Opportunity Funds, which will cover, over 142,000 of the unserved locations left in Minnesota. So we're making really good progress on closing that final gap. Many of my member companies have done a lot of work to build out to some of those most, remote areas of Minnesota, and we will continue to do that. And the good news is, as more government funding comes online and technologies continue to improve, we're improving all the time. There's a number of technologies and types of providers that might be the most economically feasible. And I don't think we should rule those out. Whether we're talking about satellite, fixed wireless, I think it's going to take all technologies to reach every corner of the state.
Thank you so much. Bernadine, same question for you. So why do we have limited networks built out in rural areas?
I want to echo what Anna and Nathan have said, that in fact, some rural areas of Minnesota have terrific broadband. In fact, I mentioned earlier the symmetrical fiber to the home network in my where I live here in Grand Rapids, and the cooperative provider that I'm a customer of, they have a 5,000 square mile area of symmetrical gigabit service, and so that rivals the best in the state. So it really has a lot to do with the kind of provider environment from the perspective of the work that we do in communities. Some providers, like cooperatives, are really well positioned to partner with communities and have access to a range of financing tools that for-profit shareholder companies do not. And it's very difficult for some of the publicly traded large companies to make these investments because, like we said, they just doesn't pencil out. And so the cooperatives are better positioned because they to sometimes serve those very hard to serve areas. And I do think we have a big opportunity in Minnesota. We have a strong Scandinavian tradition of cooperatives. We have marvelous electric cooperatives across the state and some wonderful telephones as well that because they're member centric and that they understand that the well-being of their customer base is intrinsically tied with the well-being of their cooperative, are great community partners. And so I really encourage communities that are not that need better broadband service to think about what other kinds of provider partners they can turn to.
Great, thank you so much for that. So for this next question, we're going to start with Anna. So what are some best ways ISPs could get funding for broadband build-outs in your thoughts?
Yeah, and I think first, I don't think we want to rule out any ISPs. And before we talk about public funding, I just want to state that no one's invested more than the private sector, who has invested billions in network expansions over the last decade. But for those areas where the business case for investment doesn't work, like we've mentioned, we're fortunate that the state and the Office of Broadband under DEED, which is funded by the legislature, has been a leader in providing funds to address that financial challenge in those limited areas that are difficult and expensive to serve. And we've been making progress on that for years. And now we have the federal government stepping in significantly as well. So those programs are effective when industry becomes a partner and we expand our networks with one-time financial assistance to build our infrastructure. And so we're committed to working with communities to look at other ways we can leverage those taxpayer funds, and maintaining that industry match for government funds ensures a strong commitment and better leverages the taxpayer support.
Great, thank you so much for that. So Bernadine, same question for you. What are some best ways that we could look to get funding for broadband build-outs?
I think Anna's right that we are now anticipating that there will be additional resources from the federal government. And we've really recognized that broadband connectivity is part of the solution to the pandemic experience that we all are so isolated in our homes. And so in anticipation of that, I think from my perspective that helping get the money as close to the ground as possible can be well done through block grant. And I think that Minnesota, with the great infrastructure we have here and the wonderful Office of Broadband Development and the border-to-border grant program and all the partnerships that the state of Minnesota has built, that those public dollars would be well spent in Minnesota if we receive them as a block grant. I want to also commend Nathan's efforts to get better broadband data. And it's true that we can't solve a problem that we can't see. And so that effort, I hope that all of the listeners will take the opportunity to learn about that speed test. And if you haven't yet, click on it and add to that data set. But in addition to that, we need better broadband maps at the federal level. And so I think that providers and communities alike would benefit from better mapping and would urge the federal government to fund the FCC to build those better maps that we need. And then finally, I think that public funds should be spent with public benefit in mind. And I would hope that the community voice and the community aspirations for the broadband that they need, so that broadband access is going to be an enabler and not a hindrance to the vision that communities have for themselves. And so finding ways in how we allocate dollars, whether they come through the federal dollars through block grants or the Office of Broadband Development here in the state, that community experience and perspectives and voice is a part of the decision making.
Thank you so much for that, Bernadine. So Nathan, same question for you. What are some best ways ISPs could get funding for these broadband build-outs?
Yeah, I'll keep it very simple here. Partner with the community and apply for a state or a federal grant. That's a really great way to do it. I don't really have too much to add on top of what Anna and Bernadine said here.
Great. Well, let's kick it off with the next question then. And Bernadine, we're going to start with you on this one. What can federal governments do to help meet the broadband needs of our communities? And I know we've kind of touched on this in a couple questions, but maybe we can dive a little deeper into that.
Sure. Thanks, Dana. I think that one way that federal government and here in the state is to recognize that we need public investment in adoption and use of broadband, as well as just building it out, the access piece. I like to think about it like if you have a broadband as, say, like your exercise bike you have in your basement, that just having in your basement doesn't do you any good until and unless you get on and actually ride the bicycle and use it. And so in order to ensure that the digital divide that prevents everybody in our nation to have and state to have access and use the internet gets bigger, we need public investment in adoption as well. And so I hope that our representatives will be keeping that in mind as they think about what we need to do to ensure that everybody has the tools that they need to use the internet.
Thank you so much, Bernadine. Nathan, we're going to kick it over to you. So what can the federal government do to help meet the broadband needs of our communities? And your thoughts? What do you think?
Yeah, upgrading the federal broadband service maps is a great first step. Right now, the FCC's maps aren't more detailed than the census tract level. And as we've talked about a little bit with the coalition's mapping effort, we'd like to see those maps be at the address level. We know census tracts out in rural areas can often be, sometimes they're not geographically eye-pleasing things to look at. They're often oddly shaped and stretch across multiple communities, things like that. So there can be a lot of variance in like service based on where, perhaps a large highway runs through a census tract and there's a good service along that highway. But some of the other roads that lead away from that maybe don't have that service, but yet the whole area is considered served because the main highway running through it is served. It's just an anecdote. It's not always the case. But another thing I'd like to consider, and Bernadine brought this up, and I think it's a good idea, is I'd like the federal government to consider giving out block grants to states with a proven track record of broadband investment. Minnesota has one of the best state grant programs in the entire country. Unfortunately, it hasn't ever been fully funded to the recommended levels. I sometimes think of all the good that we could do here in Minnesota with a few $100 million. We could use it to bolster the state's portion of a grant to a company to stretch our funds to go a little further, or just to be precise and target those areas that are the most expensive and the hardest to reach. Really, at the end of the day, the federal government needs to provide accurate mapping and long-term funding to build these networks in rural Minnesota.
Thank you so much, Nathan. Anna, same question for you. What can federal governments do to help meet the broadband needs of our communities?
Yeah, the federal support that we've been talking about, which we refer to as RDOF funds, Minnesota has put, $10, $20 million some years not, into our state broadband grant program. But, we're talking about $408 million in federal funds coming to the state. So I do think that over the next several years is going to allow Minnesota-based ISPs to reach the communities that lack service today. And we've seen, also activity even this year with CARES Act funding from the federal government. We've seen that be utilized to expand broadband. And Congress just passed another $300 million very recently that's going to go towards broadband infrastructure in the states. So there's a lot of activity around that. And, they've mentioned the new federal mapping efforts. I think those will allow us to know where we should be focused. And I think for a significant portion of the areas that need broadband, we know where those monies should be targeted.
Thank you so much for that. So this next question, it's a two-part question, and we'll start with Nathan. What are the steps our communities can take to get their networks built in their communities, and how can they come together to do this? Nathan, can you kick it off?
Yeah, I've got a great story for this. I spoke with a very small community in Greenfield, Minnesota this summer when I was working on the project as a project manager on the speed test initiative. And the folks in Greenfield, Minnesota are located in the far northwestern corner of Hennepin County, so still considered the metro area. It's a community of about 900 households, and I spoke to some of the people that were on the city council, and they said that as soon as the pandemic hit, that they realized quite quickly, as everybody else did, that they needed the internet and they needed it now. And so they sent out broadband surveys to every resident in the city, asking them to take a speed test, record the speed, send it back, give them some information about this. They recorded this information, found that they had some pretty crappy speeds there. They needed to do something about it. The second survey they sent out asked folks, how much would you be willing to pay for this? Would you be all right if the city government used some taxpayer funds to partner with a provider to bring service here? The response was overwhelmingly in favor of using taxpayer dollars, and the residents were willing to pony up money on their own just to get the service out to their houses. So the city council used this information and convened their city council at monthly meetings and invited providers every single month and basically conducted an interview process to see who wants to come out and serve all of these people that are willing to give you their money. Which one of you makes the most sense to work with our community? What kind of service do you provide already? I'm not sure that they've reached a final conclusion, but they took real concrete steps. And we talked about this a little bit before. They had a local champion in the city council And it doesn't necessarily need to be the city council. It could be, the township board or the school district or a business, but somebody needs to take the lead on this at the community level. And they did it in Greenfield, and they're going to get service pretty soon because of that.
That's an awesome story. Thank you so much for that. The same questions for you, Anna. What are the steps communities can take to build out networks in our communities? And what are some ways that they can come together to make this happen?
Yeah, I would really encourage communities to keep it simple. I mean, it's easy to get distracted by more studies, more maps, caught up in discussions, but the best results I have seen across the state is when communities start a conversation with providers around where they see a need and figure out what is needed to close the gap or solve the problem. And I'm happy to make those connections for anyone who is interested or needs to find a provider, but maybe it's applying for a state grant. Or maybe it's, notifying your local provider when you have a trench open to do a city water project. Maybe that's enough to close the gap in cost effectiveness. So I have seen from what I've seen across the state, partnering with the private sector ISPs has really proven to be one of the best ways to ensure that a system is built, it's maintained, it's affordable. That would be my suggestion.
Thank you so much for that. Bernadine, the same question for you. What are some steps that communities can take to get networks built out in our communities, and how can we make it happen?
I think that it's absolutely true that just understanding that local communities have the agency and the role and the need to step up into leadership role to make that happen is a really important first step. And Nathan had a really nice roadmap about demonstrating the need, and especially if you can go to your ISP partner with a roadmap of the demand and make the case. That certainly is a good example of how the squeaky wheel gets the grease. And I would just echo both of my co-panelists here to reach out to your provider and start having conversations about what your needs are. But I would also encourage communities to be ambitious. This is not a prom date. This is more like a lifetime commitment. You're going to be living with the choices that you make about the quality of the broadband network that you're investing in for a generation. And so you want to be sure that the vision and the future that your community has for itself is that the network that you get meets that need, and to be thinking for the future. We anticipate continued immense growth in the need for our networks, and so communities should be ambitious when they look for ISP partners.
Thank you so much for that, Bernadine. Well, time flies when you're having fun here. So we're in the final remarks. So I'd like to give our panelists a minute for closing remarks on broadband, whether it's key takeaways from today's conversations or any points you want to hit home with our viewers. So Anna, would you like to go first?
Oh gosh, sure. Well, thank you for tackling this issue. As you can see, there's a variety of perspectives on this topic, but I think we all share the commitment to, making sure that we connect as many Minnesotans as possible. And I just want to reiterate on behalf of my members, their commitment to investing in the communities that they serve, whether it's their number one obligation, which is to ensure the quality of their networks, but also in the programs that they have for all households to connect, whether that's low income households or seniors or whoever. They've worked really hard to be good partners, especially this past year with school districts or teachers, to bring everyone online. And sometimes that's been family by family or community center by community center, or opening their Wi-Fi hotspots, and the many other ways that we try to keep folks connected. So thank you again for having me. Thank you to my colleagues for their perspectives. And I hope you share my contact information. If there's ever a community or someone who's interested in this topic, I'd be happy to talk to them.
Thank you so much, Anna. We really appreciate your insight and your thoughts, and thank you for your final remarks. Bernadine, what are your thoughts and key takeaways from today's conversation?
I'm so grateful to 9 North for hosting this conversation. I really think it's important that we understand as a state that we're all connected metaphorically and literally, and how important broadband investment and infrastructure is to our shared future. We're really lucky to have wonderful provider partners in this state and a very effective civic infrastructure with our Office of Broadband Development, and have been, as Nathan said, really a model for others. So I think that we have the leadership that we need at the state and to make good use of the investments that we anticipate coming as part of our COVID response. And I just really commend the partners that we have here, and would echo Anna's invitation to any of the listeners that want to reach out and get support for engaging as a community in broadband access and adoption to reach out to Blandin Foundation. Thank you for the opportunity to be here tonight.
Thank you so much, Bernadine. And now we'll go to Nathan for final remarks. And Nathan, special thank you for introducing me to Anna and Bernadine. It's been such a great conversation today. So what are your final remarks on key takeaways for today?
Well, of course, a thank you to you too for setting this up and making this happen. I have very simple final remarks here. If you live in a community without broadband, make sure that you are letting your legislators know how important access to broadband is. They work for you and they also listen to you. If you work for an organization that cares deeply about broadband, have them join the Minnesota Rural Broadband Coalition. Reach out to us. We have resources for you. The best way that we can connect every Minnesotan is with a groundswell of support from communities across the state.
Thank you so much. And thank you all so much for joining us today. And through your valuable insight, we now have more perspective on rural broadband in our communities. So thank you again. I truly, truly appreciate your time.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
And thank you to our viewers for engaging with this content. For more content like this, check out our new website, www.9north.org. And please like, follow, and share us on social media, 9 North Media. We are charting a new course for our community, so continue to watch.
All right, we should be clear.
Thank you all so much. That was such a great conversation.